I'm Meredith Harold, owner and founder of the Informed SLP, and I'm here today with our second 2026 TISLP Talks Live conference presentation on pay and untangling SLP compensation and its consequences. So my background is I'm owner of the Informed SLP. I spent some time in academia as a scientist, as a professor. I also spent a little over 5 years as a school-based SLP. I also spent some years in private practice, both as an employee and as an owner of my own private practice. But for the past 10 years, I've been doing the Informed SLP primarily. And some of you at this conference are already familiar with the Informed SLP. Some of you are only lightly familiar, but most of you know us as kind of like the research and EBP people. So we have a whole team of over 50 staff, SLPs and PhDs, who go through, find all of our field's clinically relevant research each month, read it all, decide what things SLPs need to know about, and then we explain it to practicing SLPs, give them clinical resources to use, make it easy to understand, make it easy to earn CEU minutes on it, as we're one of the only CE providers in our field that allow you to track CE by the minute rather than by the half hour or hour. And we've essentially spent the last decade trying to help bridge the gap between research and practice in our field through our EBP database. But those of you who've been paying attention may have noticed that we actually launched a second database within the Informed SLP this year as well, which is our jobs database, which to us makes sense. But you might be asking, what are the EBP people doing with the jobs database of all things, and where on earth did this come from? And I do think it's important to acknowledge kind of how we got into the jobs space and why that matters and why it happened. So nothing ever happens in a vacuum. Things happen which cause other things to happen. And a few years ago, I partnered with 5 other people on a project called SLP Data Initiative. The purpose of SLP Data Initiative was to collect a ton of data on what SLPs were seeing and observing within our field, what things they liked, what things they didn't like, what concerns they had, because all of us in this group are either business owners or social media influencers or leaders in the field. And we felt like we had a pretty good insight into what was happening in our field, but we wanted to see more and wanted data to back it. So we ran this survey over the course of 2 to 3 weeks. It had a ton of both closed and open-ended questions, but all of the questions really just centered on what do you see happening in our field, what do you like, and what do you not like. And then Lucas Stuber additionally ran AI analyses for us on it because there was so much open-ended data that we obviously couldn't comb through 7,000 multi-question responses all by ourselves. So some of the things that came out of this, the biggest one was frustration with wages and jobs. SLPs having concerns about our pay, concerns about burnout. Other things that came up through this survey were training and education issues. Frustration with ASHA was a big one. DEI issues was a big one. And all of these screenshots are just some things that you could find on the SLP Data Initiative page, kind of describing what we found through the data. But over the course of that year, by late 2023, essentially the SLP Data Initiative results had indicated that job frustration, in particular pay and workload, were huge. And I was seeing this online too. SLPs were very frustrated with their jobs in general. Also by that time, I had been an employer of other SLPs for over 8 years, with strong collaboration with accountants, a business attorney, and in particular an HR attorney. I historically, as a business owner, have had a lot of kind of special interest and attention paid to HR things within our company and within our field in general. And I was noticing that a lot of the ways things were operating were not appropriate in our field. And then additionally, the research side of the Informed SLP was running really well. We had been doing these monthly research reviews and continuing ed and creation of clinical resources every single month for 8 years at that point. And so we had a handle on what we were doing, and we knew we had the capacity to contribute a little bit more. And I, in particular, was concerned that employment issues could get worse in our field without action. And so I started kind of looking at them. And also fundamentally, SLPs can't implement EBP while in crappy jobs with low pay and really high productivity requirements. And so I started to feel as though our jobs being good was something that I needed to pay attention to in order to achieve our long-term goals of supporting EBP in this field. Almost like it's a stepping stone to even having solid EBP in our field in the first place. So we started to think, well, maybe we can help out here. How could we help? So when you're trying to solve a problem, first you're kind of looking at it from the surface level, right? And being like, okay, SLPs are frustrated with their jobs, but what is it that they want? The obvious statements are that SLPs want better pay. They want to be paid more or paid fairly at least, and most employers want that too. SLPs also want better working conditions. They want it to be easier to find good employers that respect us, understand our work, allow us to implement EBP, and don't burn us out with unrealistic expectations, like in terms of productivity or barriers. And ultimately, most employers want that too. But these are really obvious statements. We want better pay. We want better working conditions. Okay, who doesn't? And what ways in which, like, in what ways are our field different or unique? Or in what ways are our problems unique? Or are we just crying the same cry that literally everyone on the planet is crying right now, right? And so I was starting to dig into it and kind of figure out, like, what does our field need specifically? As I started to look for levers of change, a lot of non-obvious things started to appear. So in 2024, we had started to build a jobs database. And the place where we started from before we really could see fully what was going on is we just wanted a higher transparency job board, assuming that better information would help. And a lot of this was driven by the fact that as an employer, I could see that transparency in the hiring space was atrocious. And frankly, it just kind of annoyed me. Like, I was like, why is it that employers aren't telling SLPs about the jobs before they start looping them into contracts? This is crazy, right? So I was like, well, at minimum, if we understood our jobs better and knew what we were choosing when we were picking jobs, you would think that would help, right? So that's the place we started from. We ended up launching this higher transparency job board in 2025, but we learned a lot throughout that year. And the picture started to sharpen as to what the real problems are in our field. And I started to notice some of the most damaging problems were things that people weren't even naming or seeing. And it started to make sense to me why SLPs were behaving as though they're being gaslit or ignored, and why they're so frustrated with just anybody and everybody above them, including like ASHA and employers. And it's because there's a lot of weird things happening in our field. So what are some of these non-obvious things that it took us at the Informed SLP a while to figure out? So we're going to go through each of these today. And some of them are a little painful, but they're really important. Okay, so non-obvious statements, but true statements. First of all, we don't know what we should be paid. And by we, I mean SLPs. We have no idea what we should be paid. That one might be obvious to some of you who spend a lot of time like on SLP Reddit or Facebook, where people are constantly saying, is this a good contract? What should I make in this setting? What should I ask for? What's reasonable? We have absolutely no freaking clue what we should be paid, okay? So statement number one. Statement number two, we also don't know what we are being paid. And when I say that, I mean SLPs on the whole have no idea what they're currently making. That one's the one that people tend to go like, no, I know how much I'm making. Like, I'm not a doofus. I know how much I'm making. But I'm going to show you throughout this lecture that there's a decent chance that you might not. We also don't understand our contracts very well as SLPs, okay? So those are the three biggest problems on the SLP side. We don't know what we should be paid, we don't know what we are paid, and we don't understand our contracts. That's going to create some problems alone. But then on the employer side, most job posts are misleading, and far more misleading than I even realized. Like, I knew they were. That's why I wanted to start a jobs database where we could control for that. But I didn't realize how bad it was until I started actually processing job posts in our field. So most job posts are misleading. There also aren't rules to prevent it, and many are benefiting from lying to SLPs. Additionally, Now, this is maybe almost the worst one because it ends up creating problems that we lose control over. People outside our field think that we're overpaid as SLPs because they're even more confused than we are. So, see those top three statements basically indicating like SLPs don't know what the heck is going on? They don't. And people outside our field understand it even less. But this is how SLPs land on those top jobs lists. Have you ever seen like dumpster fires on Instagram where people will post a screenshot and it's like top 10 highest paying jobs in 2026 and we're like number 3? It's because when people look at the data about SLPs, it looks like we're wildly overpaid. Okay? This information, this misinformation about our pay is also how state and national policies justify freezing SLPs' pay or even dropping SLPs' pay because they have the data, wrong data, but they have the data to back the fact that SLPs are overpaid. And all the SLPs in the room are like raging out right now because they're like, are you freaking kidding me? So what I'm trying to tell you is SLPs are confused. People are lying to SLPs, and all of us are operating on mostly inaccurate data regarding our jobs and wages. And it's creating this like cyclical thing that makes everything worse and worse and worse and worse over time. Hey, perhaps that's what's wrong. So it's not as simple as SLPs want to be paid more, SLPs want better jobs. No, this is the problem. The problem is that we're sitting on top of issues that we haven't noticed yet. So all of that being said, here's what we're going to do today. I'm going to start by explaining each of these not obvious statements and what we mean by them and why they matter. And then we have 2 focus points. One focus point is the point at which you're choosing a job or choosing a new job. Now, there's a reason for this. Sometimes in our field, we have a bad habit of just taking any job that sounds pretty decent, and sometimes even thinking that we're picking the best job. And then thinking that once we're in that job, we can negotiate ourselves into higher pay or out of bad productivity. But in reality, excuse me, we have to actually know what we're doing when we're choosing a job in the first place. You can't make more money just by job hopping and hoping that one of them ends up paying you better and one of them ends up treating you better. You have to choose right in the first place. So when you're looking within your metro area and there's like 10 jobs that kind of look like they might be good, sometimes it's far more than that because SLPs are hard to hire. You have to know how to choose the right one. And choosing right when on the jobs market makes a difference of tens of thousands of dollars, and it locks you into a range, both in terms of pay, productivity, quality, everything that you really can't get yourself out of unless you choose better next time. So the point at which you're choosing a job makes a massive difference. Also, we're going to focus on pay in this lecture, and it's just for the sake of time. It's not because like I think that pay is all that matters, because good jobs have a constellation of positive factors, and there's a lot of reasons why SLPs should or will choose a lower paying job because of the quality of life of that job. However, we're ignoring it for now, just for the sake of time. And then at the tail end, I'll explain what we're doing through Informed Jobs. And then to kind of loop back briefly to where we started in terms of me explaining like why are the research database people doing a jobs database now? In my mind, we're actually doing the exact same thing. What we meant to do and continue to do for our field's research is what I'm wanting to do for our field's jobs. Provide clear information, focus really heavily on quality control, and do everything in a way that will not only have an immediate impact on SLP's job pay and quality, but hopefully a long-term impact for SLP's careers in general. And so, yeah, I would say that essentially what we're doing for jobs is what we've been doing for our field's research, and I hope we make just as large of an impact on jobs. All right, so let's get into it. Let's talk about how we don't know what we're being paid. So when an SLP is choosing a job, whether or not they're like Googling SLP jobs in Chicago, or going straight to LinkedIn or going straight to Indeed. Or usually what SLPs will do is go to as many online data sources as they possibly can, trying to find all the different job opportunities. And they're looking at all these different options. SLPs always have lots of options because we're hard to hire, which means every time you're on the job market, you're choosing among many possibilities most of the time. And when you're doing this with, each of these jobs that you're seeing, you're either thinking about it one of two ways. You're probably either putting them in like yes, no, or maybe piles where you're like, not that one, not that one, maybe on this, oh, yes on this. Or you might be weighing them against each other where, you might have a couple in the yes pile when you're done and you're like, okay, these are my two top ones. And then you're making a judgment call around which one pays better. So SLPs think they can do this really easily. I used to think that I could do it really easily until I started trying to do it. So let's just do an example. You've got job A and job B. Imagine that you live in the Kansas City metro. You're looking at two different pediatric private practice options. Both of them are full-time year-round. Which job pays more? SLPs usually make these decisions in under like a minute or two. So if you want to pause the video and take a minute or two, you certainly could. But for the sake of time, we'll keep going. Which job pays more? When SLPs respond to this, I pretty consistently split the room where half the people in the space will say, oh, job A, and half the people in the space will say job B. Basically meaning we have no idea, right? And I will admit that this example is a tiny bit difficult because one of them's 1099, one of them's W-2. So you have to account for that and know how to account for that. Also, one of them has health insurance and 401k with a 3% match. So how do you assign a monetary value to that? Or are we assigning a monetary value to that? So we can make this much simpler. Let's make them both W-2. Neither has benefits. Both of them are 40 hours per week year round, so that you're working the same number of hours per year. And I'll give you a little tip that if you're working 40 hours per week year round, there's 2080 work hours in a year. And that 2080 number is going to come up again and again and again in this lecture because it's a default number that's used to calculate between annual and hourly jobs in all jobs databases and in almost every single HR department. Like 2080 for people who do hiring is just a number locked into their brain. So which job pays more? Now all you have to do is convert between hourly and annual. So what's the game plan? You can try it on a calculator if you want. So when I give people the 2080 number and I'm like, there's 2080 work hours per year, and when they have an annual number and they have an hourly number and they have to convert between them, they're basically taking 75,000 dividing by 2080 to get 36 per hour, and then 50 multiplied by 2080 to get $104,000 per year. And when I have do this exercise with grad students, 100% of the time, they're like, yep, sounds right to me. Looks perfect. That's exactly what I was planning on making, somewhere between $75,000 and $104,000 per year. And it's usually only the seasoned SLPs who've had a couple jobs, been on the job market, understand how our contracts work, that are like, no, something's wrong here. And the something that's wrong is experienced SLPs know that we're never really paid per hour. So you can't take an hourly rate that's actually, for example, a visit rate, and then use it to calculate out to how much money you're going to make in a year. So, and seasoned SLPs know this. And so when they're looking at jobs that say 50 per hour, a lot of times what they're kind of doing is operating on vibes. They're like, 50 per hour is going to make you, reasonable money, but I know it's not going to make you $100,000 per year. Okay, so what is it going to make you? And what I've found over time that even SLPs who've had many different jobs and have been in the field for 20 years still can't answer this question. So what's the pay for job B? What are you going to make in a year? Is it more or less than job A? Here's the reality. Job A is a known amount because they've told you how much you're going to make across the course of the year. And if you know approximately how many hours you're going to work, then you can calculate it out. Job B is unknown and cannot be calculated without more information. I know from experience running these contracts that job B could pay anywhere between 60 grand and over six figures. It could actually pay even more than 104,000 if they have any sort of stipends or productivity bonuses or anything like that in there. But this is a huge range and you can't calculate it without more info. Okay, so what's the more information I need? So again, people that have had these type of jobs, they'll start coaching you on it and they'll say, oh, okay, so these are the things that you should ask. You need to ask, are direct and indirect time paid differently? Or, like for example, are you not paid for indirect? You're only paid for the time that you're directly face to face with a client during treatment and evals. So that's question number one. But not all jobs work like that because some of them actually have a direct rate and an indirect rate. It's not a number and zero, it's a number and a lower number. So then you'd have to ask, okay, so what are the indirect rates? You'd have to ask, are evals paid differently? Many jobs don't pay treatment and evals the same rate, so what's the eval rate? Then you have to ask, are cancellations paid? If cancellations aren't paid, are they paid at a lower rate? Clinics have all sorts of interesting cancellation policies where, like, if the client gives 2 weeks notice, then they're not charged and therefore the SLP is either not paid or paid a lower rate. But if they cancel at the last minute and no show, then the clinic and the SLP are paid a higher rate. So that complicates things. But then you also have to ask, what are your cancellation norms? So do 5% of clients tend to cancel in this setting? Do 30% of clients tend to cancel in this setting? Both of those cancellation norms are extremely typical, right? So you can't even just, figure out, oh, are cancellations paid or unpaid? You also need to know the average cancellation rate. Then you need to ask additional things like, is there travel? If I'm traveling, is it paid or reimbursed? Paid means you're paid some sort of hourly rate for your time while driving. Reimbursed means you're just reimbursed for mileage for like gas and wear and tear on your vehicle. Those are totally different things. In some jobs, you're paid an hourly rate and reimbursed for mileage, okay? Then you can go even deeper because it's not just, for example, when we were talking about direct and indirect, whether or not their, indirect time is paid and how much, but also what the indirect time expectations are per week. Some jobs have extremely low indirect expectations. Others have wild indirect expectations where you're spending tons and tons and tons of time in their EMR system or on like really in-depth eval reports because it's what they expect, or really in-depth just weekly treatment reports and progress notes and stuff because it's what they expect. And the issue is, the more you understand about SLP contracts, the longer this question list gets. In fact, there's at least bare minimum 50 questions you would have to ask, and that still probably isn't even all of them, in order to start to figure out whether or not that $50 per hour job is paying closer to the 60 grand mark or paying over six figures. These are all the things that we thought we should ask in order to get accurate pay when we launched our jobs board. I don't know why we thought that because it took us only a month to realize we were wrong. We do still ask all of these questions with all the jobs that are in our database. Like employers are still required to disclose all this type of information. However, we do not use these questions to estimate pay because you can't. There's only one thing that will help you figure out for an hourly job what you're actually going to make in a year, and that's to ask that question. Ask for annual pay. And it's actually really simple and straightforward. So I drafted up an email on what this could look like. Hi, I saw your job post here indicating 50 per hour. I'm very interested in it. Say something nice. And then you want to ask, may I ask the expected annual or monthly, if that's easier for them to pop into an email, what's the expected annual pay for full-time work at your clinic? Employers can answer this in 2 seconds flat because they know how much their SLPs are making. They know the range of how much their SLPs are making. Do not let them answer the question this way, like, oh, you could make up to $90,000 per year. Because what you're asking is not what you could make in a false reality where flu season doesn't exist that year and nobody ever cancels, and somehow they're able to keep your caseload full at all times with a wait list. Instead, you need to know what's normal for that clinic right now, because that's the best predictor of what you're going to make in a year. So you're asking for the average or range of annual pay. Employers know this because they're running payroll. So it doesn't take any like extra math, extra time. A lot of employers have this number in their head. They're just not used to having to put it in job posts. And even if they don't have that number locked in their head, it takes them 2 seconds to find it. A lot of times, though, SLPs still feel like, that's a weird thing to ask, though. Like, they're already telling me what I'm going to be paid. They're not telling you what you're going to be paid. So they're like, why would I ask for a second pay number when they already gave me one pay number? The reason is because if you care at all about what you're making, and if you care at all about the possibility of the range of your pay being tens of thousands of dollars, you have the right to ask. And also, this is the right question to ask. If you try asking anything other than this, there's simply too many questions to ask, and that's a waste of both your time and the employer's time. I'm telling you, this is such an easy question for employers to answer. Also, asking all these other questions would be far less accurate and just gets you squishy estimates. What you really want is real data so that you're not having to guess and run a ton of math, but are simply getting the number. And I promise you, as an employer, as someone who interfaces a lot with our field's employers aren't offended by you asking a basic money question that takes them no time at all to answer. This is a very easy thing to request. But maybe you think you don't need it, right? Maybe you're like, nah, I don't need the annual pay. I can judge jobs based on the details and based on some questions. Okay, so then let's do it. I'll make this as easy as humanly possible. So we'll have job X, $50 per hour full-time, job Y, $50 per hour full-time. So they're both $50 per hour jobs. What are you actually going to be making in a year? And what I try to do is fill in all of this with a ton of information that the employer could disclose to you. Like some of it they could disclose in the job post, which would make it easy for you to figure it out. Other things might be things that you have to ask about, but then they tell you. But this is the type of information that you're going to get if you start asking like all these other questions. You'll get information about, how time is paid, about the population. Maybe if you ask, you can get some information about cancellations. Maybe you can get some information about indirect time, travel time, all that type of stuff. Now, newbie SLPs usually still can't tell the difference between these two jobs. Like they have to really think carefully about it, and sometimes they don't know just because they don't have experience working SLP jobs yet. However, seasoned SLPs, a lot of times they can take a second, look at these lists, and they know exactly which one pays more. And the one that pays more is job Y, the one on the right. But I think of this almost as like job guess who, where you're sitting here playing these games where you're like, does your job have glasses? Does your job have red hair? Does your job have blue eyes? But in this game of guess who, you're never able to flip down all the things and say, your job is Stephanie, your job is John, because you can't get all the way to the end, no matter how many questions you ask, unless you're asking for their clinic norms on monthly and annual pay. So a lot of times SLPs will be like, well, this is close enough. Like I know how to choose a good $50 per hour job versus a bad $50 per hour job. And I'm sure you do. But have you internalized how big of a difference there really can be between these jobs? Probably not. Job X is the type of job, and both of these, by the way, are based on real jobs that we've had in our database this past year. Job X is the type of job that's going to be a lot more variable, and the range is going to be lower. So you might make between $55,000 and $75,000 per year. In job Y, the range of pay is going to be tighter and the overall pay is going to be higher. And this is based exclusively on like clinic norms and how these jobs are set up. It's not because the job Y employer is nice. It's because the job Y employer is doing a remote only clinic with an adult and teen population that hardly ever cancel. They've set it up so that there's very low indirect time expectations, and simply like the client population and clinic operational setup is what causes them to be able to pay you better. Job X can't control the fact that you're going out to client homes, that little kids get sick all the time, that families are going to cancel on you. They have no more control over that than you do. And there's no amount of getting into Job X and saying, well, I have a friend who makes, 20 grand more than me, so you should be paying me that. Job X can't pay you that. Job Y easily can, okay? And the reason it's because these are totally different jobs, right? And I would argue that most SLPs care about this type of range. Most SLPs do care whether or not they're making about 60 grand a year versus 90 grand per year. These jobs give you a completely different lifestyle, and you can't negotiate yourself out of this range later. So the initial contract and clinical setup matters, and asking about the annual pay matters. We cannot, as a field, continue to say, this is a $50 per hour job, this is a $50 per hour job, because those numbers are nonsense. They mean absolutely nothing. And the individual problems matter. Like, I worry about individual SLPs choosing jobs and not realizing what they're going to be paid. But the thing that's really the stickler that really messes us up is the way in which this plays out in the SLP community and how that impacts our entire field. Because if you were to get on social media or like have a private conversation with these SLPs, both of them will tell you they make $50 per hour. Both of these SLPs work the same number of hours. So they're both in full-time jobs year-round, working approximately 40-hour work weeks. They'll tell you, I make $50 per hour, I make $50 per hour. And so if you start discussing pay with them, you won't be able to tell anything at all about what they're actually making. And another way this will play out is the Job X person will say, I make $50 per hour, and that's not nearly enough for SLPs. You should never, ever, ever, ever take a job that pays $50 per hour, and especially not lower, because it's not enough money to live off of. And then the Job Y person will come into like the Reddit thread or whatever and say things like, what's wrong with your budgeting? Why can't you pay your bills? Because I live in the same city as you. I also make $50 per hour, and I actually am doing fine. Like, I think we're fairly paid. And then the person holding Job X feels like, ignored and gaslit. And they're like, what reality are you living in? And then the Job Y person is also thinking the same thing. Like, what reality are you living in? We actually make pretty decent money as SLPs, right? It's because they're not even talking about the same thing. They're using a phone number to discuss money. But this is the norm right now of what happens in the SLP field. If you get onto any of the like SLP job Facebook groups, which is where I pulled all these from, like salary transparency groups and like just groups that focus on SLP jobs in general, everybody talks about pay in hourly terms, and almost nobody will convert from hourly to annual because SLPs typically don't do that. They lock that $50 per hour number in their head because it's what it says at the top of their contract, ignore all the other details, and then just roll with it. So a solution is we all as a community really need to help other SLPs understand why we've got to stop talking about hourly pay without annual estimates. It's okay to continue talking about hourly pay. It is not okay to continue talking about hourly pay without disclosing annual as well. Hourly without annual is not close enough. We regularly see variability of $40,000 plus in our jobs database where two jobs have the same hourly rate, but the actual annual take-home pay is $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 a year different. This matters. This is a huge impact on SLP pay. But SLPs think it's close enough because they don't have the opportunity to run real math on real offers. And I'm not meaning to like speak down on SLPs. Like, SLPs are my heart and I care deeply about our field. I just want to make clear to you all that like this isn't okay. And my brain was where your brain was just a year and a half ago. I also thought that hourly rates were close enough. I knew that they weren't ideal, and we had ideas to like put into our jobs database that we would always disclose annual with hourly, but I had no idea how bad it was because I wasn't running contract numbers every single day. But now that, there's a handful of us operating the jobs database and we're seeing real SLP contracts come through every single day and we have the opportunity to run math on them, suddenly it hits you where you're like, oh, hourly means nothing. It literally means nothing. And so that is actually the most important, one of the most important things I want you all to get from this lecture today, because it impacts a ton of other things that we're going to talk about today as well. So hourly without annual is not close enough. But then we further lose track of if it's close enough if we're not also running math once we're in a job. And I would argue that most SLPs aren't. So most SLPs, once they're in this job X or job Y, they continue thinking about it as a $50 per hour job. We know they do because it's how they talk about pay with each other. They don't flip to saying, oh, my contract says 50 per hour, but I make this per year. So when you're in the job, and I pose this question to literally everyone in the room, if you're in some sort of hourly type job, do you think about what your annual pay is? Do you think about what the range is? Do you think about how it varies across certain months and in things like cold and flu season? Do you know how much you're making per year? And I don't mean the amount of money that lands in your bank account each month. I mean, comping it to an annual job. Do you know how much you're making? So gross, not net. Are you paying attention to this over the course of the year? Or is that number that you were hired in at, the whatever per hour, the number that you still have in your brain and the one that you use to talk about your pay with other SLPs? Same thing with people in salaried jobs. If you're in a salaried job making 80 grand per year, have you ever thought about what you make per hour? When you're on social media talking to fellow SLPs and they're like, oh, SLPs should make XYZ per hour, are you able to participate in this conversation because you've actually calculated from annual to hourly as well? And not only do I know that SLPs really aren't thinking about their pay once they take a job, they're just kind of going with it and whatever happens, happens. I know that because of how SLPs talk about pay on social media, but I also know it because early when we started our jobs database inside the Informed SLP, our own staff realized this with each other. So the Informed SLP has a massive staff of, it's usually between about 50 and 60 people at any given time. But we don't need 60 people to operate, or to produce the monthly research reviews full time. We just need lots and lots and lots of part-time people because of their expertise. So we have dysphagia experts, stuttering experts, voice experts, autism experts, and a lot of people at the Informed SLP actually work with us part-time. So it's a very common model for people within our company as SLPs to be working with us like 10 to 20 hours per week and then have another SLP job too. So it actually was kind of a convenient thing for us to discuss as a team. And once we started talking about these issues as a team, we all realized that even our most brilliant staff members who understand journal articles easily, understand statistics, are, like top of their class type people, are in hourly jobs and never once even considered what they actually are making per hour, nor what they're making per year. So this was one of those things, again, that hit us internally where we were like, wow, we really aren't paying attention to how much money we're making at all. We're just locking that number that we're hired into. And then because we're like anchored at that number and then aren't paying attention to what happens with our real paycheck and how that calculates out over the course of the year, most of us have no idea if, what we're actually making per hour or what we're making per year. And this matters not only for SLP's real pay, and if we collectively want to grow our pay as a field, we have to actually know what we're making in the first place, but also because whatever is in your brain will come out of your mouth. So if you're someone in these job X, job Y type contracts that in your brain you're telling yourself you make 50 per hour, that's what's going to come out of your mouth when you talk to other SLPs. And it's not nearly as helpful as if you're actually figuring out what you make per year as well and disclosing that. Okay, so let's move on to most job posts are misleading. In order to understand that job posts are misleading, you have to first understand that hourly rates mean absolutely nothing. So now that you understand that hourly rates are basically meaningless, try going and looking for a job. Some of you might have done that recently. Some of you maybe haven't done this for 15 years because you're in a leadership role as an SLP and you love your job and you've been in the same contract forever, getting raises, but not on the job market, right? The SLP field has slowly morphed into a situation in which we almost exclusively talk about our pay as hourly. Sure, there's lots of salaried jobs out there still, but when you look for jobs, job platforms convert them to hourly because the number of hourly rate jobs has gone up and up and up and up so much that everybody seems to think that SLPs want to talk about their pay as hourly. Now, if hourly means nothing, what do you think this does to our pay norms and our understanding of pay? That's kind of like a preview thought for where we're going to head later. But if you haven't recently looked at job posts in your area, I would highly encourage it, especially those of you who mentor other SLPs and view yourself as kind of like a peer mentor or a leader in the field. If you aren't actively seeing what other people are seeing just by spending 5 or 10 minutes doing a job search, I would highly recommend it. It will disturb you if you haven't done it in a while. And it's not that job posts are low detail. In fact, a lot of them are very high detail, but they're the wrong details. So this, for example, is a screenshot that I grabbed from an SLP Facebook group, which is a wonderful group where SLPs go to talk about pay with each other. And this is what this CF wrote. Hi, everyone. I recently received an offer from this place for my CF in Metro Detroit. I was hoping to get some insight on if it's a good offer for a private practice. So this private practice gave them tons of information about their pay. They said you're going to make $40 per half hour session, $70 for evals, $20 per hour for documentation time, so $20 per hour for indirect, $10 for no shows. And then it talks about like your PTO and your paid holidays, and it comes with benefits, which is wonderful because not all private practice jobs do. So they've got dental, vision, healthcare benefits. And then this CF says, I've met the head of the clinic, the office staff, and the other professionals in the clinic, and I liked them all. So what this CF is thinking right now is, I like these people. I like this job. I want to take this job, but they're still coming onto Facebook, detailing it out for everyone else and asking them for their insight. Why are they asking them for their insight? It's because this SLP is smart and he or she knows that they have no idea what they're about to be paid. This SLP has no idea what they're about to be paid, even though the clinic disclosed all the ways in which they pay them. Why? Because these details don't help you get an estimate of your monthly and annual pay because there's still too many details missing. How often do no-shows occur? How big are the gaps between clients? On average, how many clients do you have per day? Like, you can't calculate this without even more information. And this is what most job posts do. And a lot of employers don't even realize they're doing it. They're entering all these details, thinking they're being transparent about pay. This looks on the surface as transparent, but it's not. That person has no idea what they're about to make per year. None. And again, like if you're somebody who's like, no, I bet I could figure it out. Try pausing the video and attempting to run the math, and you'll start to immediately encounter questions and issues with being able to run it correctly. And I see this constantly online. This one is from a more seasoned SLP. So they've had lots of SLP jobs. They're in the process of considering, moving, and they're trying to decide between two different jobs. One where they are going to be making between $90,000 and $100,000 per year annually because annual pay was disclosed up front. The other in which they were only given hourly rates. 75 for treatment, 70 for supervision, 100 for evaluation, and then all these other details. That top job, by the way, is a variable contract, not hourly, but we'll talk about contracts later. But again, this SLP is going to the masses because they have absolutely no idea how much money they're going to make in that home health job. They have no way of knowing, and they feel like because the employer gave them all these details, it makes them feel almost the one who's in the wrong and the one who's clueless because they can feel that they don't know if this is a good offer, but the employer also handed them all these details. So it's this weird, uncomfortable feeling where like, you know that something is wrong, you know that you're uninformed, but you think it must be you because you were given so many details. You were given the wrong details. You have no idea what you're about to make in terms of pay. And all of the comments in this thread don't help. They basically go through and are like, oh, I'd choose this job for this reason. Oh, I'd choose that job for this reason. When in reality, what this SLP needs to be told is, go back and ask that home health job what the anticipated monthly or annual pay is, both the range and average. And then immediately they would know what the pay difference is. And then once they know what the real pay difference is between these two jobs, then this SLP can start to figure out like, what other details do I care about that are also in this job post. So how did we get to this place where we're all talking about pay with nonsense numbers that mean absolutely nothing, where SLPs increasingly think of their pay as hourly, and savvy SLPs know that it's not really hourly, but they still feel like it's like close enough, even though hourly rates are wildly misleading due to contract differences. Once this clicks and once people see it, this is where their brain tends to start. They assume, okay, I see what employers are doing. Employers are obviously evil and greedy, and they must be paying me, these differential hourly rates where all the hourly rates for different work types are different because they want to make more money. They just want higher margins. And we start with this kind of like zoomed in view where fault is attributed to the employers. However, that's an uninformed way of looking at the actual problem. So I want to briefly spend just a couple slides talking about how we got to this place so that you can see that employers are operating in a faulty system just like you are, but different things are impacting them. So SLPs will then do this whole like, oh, it must be employer greed. And because they could pay us in these confusing hourly contracts that mean absolutely nothing, they must be doing that so that they can make more money. And that must be the reason why we are seeing an increasing number of hourly jobs over salary jobs. No, that's not how this happened. Okay, so this has been a problem in the making for decades. A lot of these things triggering in roughly the late 90s, but things have gotten real bad in the last 10 years, and in the last 5 years they've gotten almost comical with how bad they are. Not comical because it's not funny, it's really bad for our field, but we need to understand kind of how we got here so that we don't just assume like employers are pulling this out of nowhere just to torture us. All right, so when you have a gig economy, SLP shortage, increase in telepractice, COVID exacerbated a lot of that, plus legal and financial incentives to employers, you're gonna start to see an environment where all those factors cause more and more 1099 and PRN contracts where people are stepping in to fill in hours. 1099 and PRN contracts will never be salary. Those are naturally hourly jobs, not because like somebody wants them to be hourly, but because they're by nature hourly and like a lot of times legally hourly, right? Add in there that when you start to have more and more 1099 and PRN contracts, we also start to normalize 1099 in our field, which increases the wage theft and illegal misclassification. We'll talk about that later. That's a whole other topic. But then layer on top of that, not only all these like gig economy, SLP shortage, telepractice issues that caused an increase in 1099 and PRN, but additionally, other things were happening. Reimbursement hasn't always been tied to direct time, but once you start tying reimbursement to direct time, it starts to make more logical sense to pay SLPs for direct time, okay? But then add to that we're experiencing reimbursement rate cuts. So Medicare reimbursement rate cuts, a lot of this triggers reimbursement rate cuts across the board, or when, so a lot of employers have noticed not even like rate cuts in addition to flatlining, so both of those things. But essentially what happens is when all these things happen together, it starts to turn it into an environment where employers start to feel as though they have to pay differential hourly rates, not to achieve higher margins, but in order to survive. So there's essentially these external pressures on clinic owners, employers, that make it so that they have to start paying SLPs that way, or at minimum feel they have to start paying SLPs that way in order to simply survive this environment. Then layer on top of that that as soon as you start creating these like creative contracts where it's like, oh, I'm going to pay you $60 per hour instead of 50, fine print, you're paid for less hours per week. These like fake high hourly numbers, so the more differential the pay is within the SLP's contract, those fake hourly numbers fill jobs faster. Why? Because SLPs haven't caught on to the fact that hourly rates are pointless and meaningless and mean absolutely nothing whatsoever. And when jobs fill faster, hiring platforms make more money, agencies make more money, and there's zero incentive for employers to describe pay in real terms because SLP's behavior doesn't incentivize that. So what we end up getting is declining job post transparency. And now, add on to the side that student loan debt is rising. So that, is a wonderful thing to be happening all at this time. But as a group, SLPs don't realize how meaningless hourly rates have become. And because of that, in 2026, SLPs have less pay transparency than we did before, less pay transparency than we did 5, 10, 20 years ago, and less pay transparency than most fields. And when you see this for what it is, and when you get it, it feels like being lied to. When I first noticed this, I was like, oh, wow. And when you don't get it, like before you start to realize what's really happening with our contracts as SLPs, it just feels like a general financial stress that you can't quite name, you can't quite get yourself out of. You're job hopping and constantly wondering if there's some other job that's better than the one you have because you haven't yet figured out what the triggers are for your pay in the first place, because you're still out there comparing jobs based on fake hourly rates. And when I say that there's declining job post transparency, I don't mean that it's on purpose or that there's widespread nefarious intent from employers. Employers have been pushed into this system. And so, but what I do mean is that when this happens, it causes a normalization of contracts with opaque compensation structures. When everybody is doing it that way, suddenly it just becomes the norm to not have any pay transparency whatsoever in our job posts and in SLP hiring. And when that's the norm across the board and SLPs aren't noticing it, suddenly it's simply the way it works. Quick aside before you all get too frustrated with employers, because a lot of this lecture is from the SLP perspective and talking about what SLPs need for themselves and what SLPs need to be doing in order to protect ourselves in our field. And the more you learn and the more you become empowered with information, I want you to focus on making sure that what your empowerment looks like is learning how SLP pay works, learning how contracts work, learning how hiring actually works, learning how to be savvy in negotiations, learning all these things about SLP employment so that you can stand up for yourselves and others, help inform other SLPs, and also make it so that you can make solid choices for yourself. Eyes wide open, full consent. What it is not is raging out at employers and assuming blame and increasing mistrust for employers, like employers must be evil if all this is happening. That's a very shortcut way of thinking, because I only spent 2 seconds explaining to you from an employer perspective why all of this is happening. But what you have to recognize is that employers are stuck in the same systems you are, just with different problems. So as there's all these things pushing on SLPs, and our job is to look at what things we do and don't need to consent to being pushed into, employers experience the same thing. There's all these things pushing on them, and they too have to figure out, what they can stand up against and what is just a consequence of the system that they have, that they're completely powerless to be inside of. But on the whole, our biggest wins will come from identifying what both SLPs and employers need and pushing on those issues the hardest. And we don't have time for me to explain in today's lecture what it's like from the employer perspective. The only thing I encourage you all to do is not assume that employers are evil if they're being misleading or confusing or paying you less than you want to be paid, because most employers do not want to be doing that. Okay, let's move on to the other not obvious statement. We don't know what we should be paid. We've already figured that one out. But this is also because almost all online sources of wage norms for SLPs are wrong. When you go try to find information about what SLPs are paid, you will find almost exclusively incorrect information. If you go on Indeed, if you go onto Google, if you go onto Glassdoor, if you go into any large language models, so if you go into like ChatGPT, Claude, all of these will be wildly wrong if you ask about SLP pay, no matter how you ask about it. They don't have access to good data. Do you all have any guesses as to why all of these data sources are all wrong? Could it partly be because SLPs don't know what they're being paid in the first place and are feeding visit rates? Like, oh, I make 70 per hour into these pay databases. Yeah, so almost all wage norm data for SLP is wrong for two reasons. The number one reason is SLP's hourly wages aren't hourly. So you can't take hourly, multiply it by 2080 and get annual. And because SLPs also don't realize this, they're constantly feeding these fake rates into these wage data systems. So even when you survey SLPs, you have to be really careful with what they say to you, because two SLPs will say, I make 50 per hour, I make 50 per hour, and these wage data sources will take that 50, multiply it times 2080, and say, oh, you make $104,000 per year, which ends up skewing absolutely everything. So you have salary data mixed in with true hourly data, mixed in with visit rates, and most people don't know how to survey SLPs correctly in a way that SLPs won't just feed misinformation into the system. So that's problem number one. But then problem number two is also, SLPs aren't even all paid 2080 work hours per year due to number one, and also due to the high percentage of 9 and 10 month contracts. Over half of SLPs aren't on 12-month contracts and therefore aren't paid 2080 hours per year. School-based SLPs are on 9 and 10 month contracts. So you can't use that 2080 hour or 2080 number with them anyway. And over half of us that applies to. And then, honorable mention, job post ranges aren't wage norms. So a lot of these databases, what they'll do is they'll say, oh, we see this job post ad and the SLP will be paid somewhere between 65,000 and 120,000. And they'll take the middle of that and assume that that's what the pay is for that job, when a lot of us know that in reality, some of those ranges are a little bit fake in and of themselves. So almost all online sources mess this up, including jobs databases like Indeed and Glassdoor. But then here's the really scary one. The Bureau of Labor Statistics messes this up too. They mess it up just as badly as everyone else. The BLS is PhD level economists. So people assume that this is the gold standard. And so anybody who's in journalism, news reporting, science, like the BLS is the data set that's used to describe pay in our own field's journal articles. This is what feeds into LLMs. Everything is powered by the BLS. But the BLS makes both error 1 and 2. So the bright red flag that you should always watch out for is if any of these systems use 2080 to translate between hourly and annual, that's going to be a problem, because that's not going to be accurate for SLP wages. And even if they don't use 2080, if they aren't asking people to report in monthly or annual wages in addition to the number of hours actually worked, then the data also is going to be wrong. This is what the BLS data looks like. It's from the federal government, from the U.S. Department of Labor, typically very reliable in all the information that they put out. But this isn't what our wages are. And it looks so detailed and, accurate and scientific and right and fancy. I mean, look at the tables. The tables have to be right. It's divided up by work setting, which is super useful. They have both hourly and annual. But I want to draw your attention to the fact that everything in the hourly column, if you multiply it by 2080, is what you get in the annual column. Now, let's think this through logically. Let's look at that very first line, elementary and secondary school SLPs. The vast majority of SLPs in elementary and secondary schools are on 9-month contracts, some of them 10, most of them 9. So they don't work 2080 work hours per year. So then you're forced to trying to figure out, okay, so which of these numbers is wrong then? Is it that the hourly is wrong, or is it that the annual is wrong? Like, do I need to divide by something other than 2080 hours per year, or do I need to multiply by something other than 2080? But the answer is that both of them are wrong, because the way the BLS is collecting data is they're collecting it by setting, right? So like, what setting do you work in? But then you can put in either hourly or annual wages. And so there's hourly being fed into the data set. A lot of this hourly stuff is direct time only, especially when you're a contractor within the schools, where you're actually paid for 35 hours per week, but most definitely expected to work 40 because they're not paying you for any of the indirect time. And annual. So they've got all sorts of different contract types, true hourly rates, direct time only rates, annual rates, all feeding into the same data set. So it's actually wrong in every single direction. And you might scan through these numbers and see certain numbers that you know are wrong and certain numbers that feel right-ish. Sometimes these wages will look right if they're actually, if the data set that it's pulled from has both overestimates and underestimates. Sometimes it can end up looking okay-ish, but it's still just wildly wrong and you don't usually know in which direction. So, how are you supposed to find good wage data for SLPs? You can't, unless you're looking at wage sources that don't screw it up. So there's 2 exceptions, only 2. Contact me if you think you've found another one, but I've looked into this very deeply. There's only 2. ASHA doesn't mess it up. Surprise, ASHA understands how SLP's contracts work, so they don't do goofy math like ask a elementary school SLP what they make per year and then divide that by 2080 and assume that that's their hourly rate, because it doesn't work that way. Because ASHA understands SLP work and SLP contracts, their wage norms are actually all accurate. Now, a lot of times people don't like looking at ASHA's wage norm data because it's lower than other sources. ASHA's numbers will be lower than this misinformation that you're getting. Where were those slides? Here they are. ASHA's numbers are lower than what you'll get if you get on ChatGPT or if you go on Indeed. These are wrong. ASHA's are right. And what we want to be operating with if we're going to advocate as a field for fellow SLPs is accurate data, right? So use ASHA's data. The downside of ASHA's data is the data set itself is small, so it really doesn't have enough data points to be highly useful, and it's not open access, so you can't run analyses on it. You can't export a spreadsheet and narrow it by what you're really looking at. Instead, you have to just accept all of the averages that they're calculating out for you, and some of them are kind of meaningless. So, for example, knowing what SLPs on average make in the state of Kansas is kind of irrelevant, because what we make in the Kansas City metro, or what people would make in Wichita, Kansas, which is another big city, is not what you're going to make in rural Kansas. And so some of the groupings are kind of nonsensical and not useful. But the reason they group it that way is because their data set isn't large enough. It's not a large enough data set to be granular enough by city. We also are collecting SLP wage data. We're still a little on the fence about some of the things we may or may not want to do with it. So we haven't ramped it up very fast. We'll make a decision at some point in 2026 as to how we're going to do this and what we're going to do with it. But one of the problems that we face is getting SLPs to feed us accurate information in the first place. We actually end up having to throw out a lot of SLPs data because they're reporting it into our system inaccurately. Or they'll give us one number but not another. So like they'll give us a visit rate but not enough information about how many hours they're actually paid on average in a week, month, or year. So more on that later, but that's a big problem in our field right now. The fact that it's hard to find decent wage norms, especially if you don't deeply understand how all these different numbers are right and wrong, which ones you can trust, which ones you can't, and which direction they're right and wrong in. And then here's the most important part about not having decent wage data. It's not just the fact that an individual SLP will have difficulty knowing if what they're being paid is fair. Here's the bigger problem. When non-SLPs have access to wage data that is wrong, this wage data impacts policy. It impacts reimbursement rates. It impacts decisions that are being made at both the state and national level. And the data is wrong in a direction that is not to our advantage because most wage estimates for SLPs online are consistently too high. This is how we end up on top jobs list. This is how people easily justify flatlining our pay or even cutting our pay. It's because other people outside of our field also don't have access to decent wage data for SLPs, and they don't realize it. They most definitely don't realize it. Like if you try telling them that they can't trust the BLS data, they'll think that you've lost your mind, right? So this is a huge problem. And anybody who does any sort of advocacy when it comes to SLP pay has to understand this because people are going to argue with you that we're paid enough. And you have to be able to show them why they're using wrong numbers and why they have to throw out all the data that they just tried, showing to you. Okay, SLPs don't understand our contracts as well as we need to. Or even when we understand our own contract really well, we don't tend to understand other SLPs' contracts. And this high variability of contract type also makes pay and contract discussions really confusing. So we're going to spend some time going through contracts. Okay, so there are 3 contract types: salaried, hourly, and variable hourly. So salaried is when you're paid like $80,000 per year. Hourly is when you're paid, for example, $40 per hour, but you are not on an hourly contract if you aren't paid the same amount for all hours worked. If you have hours that are worked that are unpaid or not guaranteed or paid at variable rates, that's not an hourly contract. That's a variable contract. These variable contracts also go by different names depending on how they're set up. So like pay per visit contracts are variable, differential, tiered, multi-rate, all of those are variable contract types. Now, these two, hourly or variable, these are binary categories. You're either paid for all the hours you work or you're not. However, the impact on pay within this variable category is more like a spectrum. So when you're analyzing SLP wages, you can't just say, oh, you're hourly, therefore I'll apply this calculation, or oh, you're variable, therefore I'll apply this calculation, because the way these variable contracts are set up is all over the place. But roughly 70% of the jobs that we see in our database are variable, not hourly. So when SLPs are talking about pay as hourly, rarely are they talking about pay accurately because most of their contracts are variable. So what are the impact of this? So variable contracts have become more common, and they're more common because, like I said several minutes back, employers are kind of forced to move this way. Here's how that plays out. So in job ads, variable contracts look like higher pay, and SLPs aren't adjusting for this in their application behavior. So if you're an employer and you can post a job post that says 60 per hour and you're in a being comped against other people that are posting 40 per hour, SLPs that aren't paying attention to the fact that these things aren't comparable and 60 isn't actually more than 40 in this situation will choose the 60 per hour job. So what SLPs are saying to employers is, we want you to pay us the same rate for all hours worked. We want you to pay us for indirect time. But when the vast majority of SLPs, when they see two jobs in front of their face, are going to choose the 60 over the 40, it's incentivizing employers to continue on with these variable hourly contracts because SLP's behavior is that they want those, even though what they're saying out of their mouth is we want to be paid the full rate for indirect time. So these unpaid hours make all paid contracts look artificially low, pushing employers toward variable ones. Employers across the board rarely disclose unpaid hours. No one requires it in job posts. No one requires true hourly rates. And so an employer's hand is kind of forced where everybody is basically lying around them. They kind of have to normalize to it in order to be able to hire at all. So there's really three parties here, all making the problem worse. It's SLP's own behavior and not understanding this. It's employers allowing it to happen. And it's job boards that don't care at all if the number that you insert in there is actual pay or just like a fake vanity number. And these variable hourly rates, that's all they are. They're just fake vanity numbers. Okay. But we're not done because there's not just three contract types. You also then need to feed these through the reality that you can also be 1099 or W-2 as an SLP. 1099 versus W-2, most people understand fairly well if they've been in our field a long time. Not everybody, so we'll spend a few minutes talking about it, but we also have additional resources on our website to differentiate 1099 from W-2 if this is at all confusing to you, because I'm going to try to move through it like at a reasonable pace. Okay, so I like to call these 1099 versus W-2, even though 1099 is actually the tax form issued to you as a contractor and W-2 is the tax form issued to you as an employee. So like properly, we should be calling these employee versus contractor. The reason I don't do that is because lots of employers don't know the difference themselves. And so they call everybody they hire their employee, but then they'll issue you a 1099. And so you're not an employee, you're a contractor legally. And so I feel that it's best to use the 1099 W-2 shorthand in order to ensure you're on the same page with your employer about how you're going to be classified. But this classification is based on behavioral, relationship, and financial factors. And it's based on both federal and state laws. So there's like broad umbrella federal laws that differentiate 1099 from W-2, but then there's also some state level things that are specific to various states. Legal implications. Most SLPs don't realize this, but W-2 are protected by labor laws, 1099 are not. In this lecture, we'll focus, or I'll try to focus mostly on financial implications, though I do want to briefly touch on behavioral and relationship stuff. But the financial implication is that it's roughly 10% more expensive to you to be a 1099 contractor. So let's take just a couple slides to break this down. I like to use a house analogy when I'm talking about W-2 versus 1099, because I think taking it outside of our field with a situation that makes sense to most people and then applying it back to our field really helps illuminate things. So imagine a business as a house. A lot of us on this video, even if we're not business owners, we are used to managing our household and what it's like to manage a household. So imagine a business is like a house. Anybody who's a W-2 employee exists inside the house, within the house, is protected by the house, is a member of the household. 1099 contractors, those are separate businesses. Those are separate households that interface with the main business, but they're not actually protected within the walls of the house, nor do they exist legally or financially inside the house at all. So businesses can have both W-2 and 1099. They can almost never be SLPs that are W-2 and 1099 unless those two people are being treated totally differently. Most of the time, businesses will be set up where all their SLPs are 1099 or all their SLPs are W-2. I would estimate, and this is just a personal estimate, that approximately 2/3 of the people calling their SLPs 1099s are actually doing so illegally because they don't truly understand what it means to have a 1099 contractor. But we'll kind of go through that. So, also, if you're a 1099 contractor and you didn't realize it, congratulations, you're a business owner. You will be treated both legally and financially as a business owner. Everything falls under your house. You're not employed anywhere, actually. You simply have a contract as a business owner with another business. Okay, so let's roll with the house analogy. What would it look like in like a real house to have 1099 versus W-2? So let's imagine that I'm someone who wants to get my house painted. That would be a situation in which I would find a contractor at 1099, and they, as an expert, would come to my house and paint my house. We're going to have a contract. It's going to say how much they're paid. However we work that out, the terms of the contract are written down. We both sign on the dotted line. That painter has their own business, and they're simply coming to my house to lend their expertise, provide a service, and paint my house. Let's say I asked them to paint the outside of my house. Here's some of the things I can't do. It would be weird and inappropriate for me to like deeply oversee their work. Let's say the painter's name is John. I can't be like, John, I need you to be here at 8 o'clock on the dot, and you're going to be in trouble if you show up at 8:05. John, I need you to start on the east side of the house, not the west side of the house. John, I need you to use this type of ladder. I need you to use these type of paintbrushes. In fact, John, you're going to use all of my supplies because I'm the one fully controlling your work. I just want you to do the work. That's really not the way it works. John is instead, as a 1099 contractor, treated as an expert. His job is to get the work done. I don't have the control over John to tell him how to paint the house, what brand of paint to use, what ladder to use, what paintbrush to use, whether or not to like move his paintbrush this way or move his paintbrush that way. I mean, there's certainly things I can ask for, like of course, like I get to choose my color, and maybe I do have preferences like the brand of the paint, and maybe I do have a preference like I want you to start on the east side of the house instead of the west side for some like goofy reason, like I'm wanting to like do something with the bushes on that other side. But for the most part, John is the boss of himself. He's simply coming over to do a job and get paid for it. That would be a 1099 contractor. If I had a W-2 employee at my house, that would be someone more like a nanny. Almost all nannies are W-2 and legally have to be W-2. So if any of you on the call has ever worked as a nanny, you were actually an employee of the people you worked for, probably, unless they were misclassifying you. Another example would be like a butler. Like a butler would be a W-2 employee of the house. So with the butler, they can show up and I can completely dictate their work. I can say, oh, and we'll just use the same name, John. Let's assume John is the butler. Different John though. And he comes over and I'm like, oh, today I want you to do laundry. Today I want you to run some errands for me. Today I want you to like address all these envelopes and put stamps on them and then take them to the post office. Today I actually want you to rearrange my closet because like it's been winter and it's transitioning into summer, and I want you to take all my winter clothes, put them in the basement, take all my summer clothes, put them back in the closet, that type of stuff. You get to decide exactly how the butler does their job because you have full control over their work. The butler is your employee. That 1099 contractor painter is not your employee. I couldn't say to the painter, oh, and I should have probably given them names, but they're both John now, so it's too late. John the painter, actually, I've been wanting to hang this picture in my living room, but I can't decide if it should go on this wall or this wall. Could you come hold up the picture, Painter John, so that I can decide, where I want to put it? Oh, Painter John, I actually wanted to move this couch from our living room down to the basement. I know you're good at moving things. Could you come help me move this? All of that would be wildly inappropriate because those aren't things that are on the contract of John the painter. John the painter is here to do a paint job. He's there to be the boss of himself. He's not there there to do whatever I ask him to do, right? This is the behavioral and relationship difference part of 1099 and W-2. So when you like translate that to SLP, let's think about a school that might have 1099 contractor SLPs and W-2 employee SLPs. The W-2 employee SLPs can be asked to do things like bus duty. The 1099 contractor SLPs cannot. The W-2 employee SLPs can be told how to do evaluations, how to do treatment. The 1099 contractor SLPs cannot. And if they start to be, it starts to be an issue of misclassification because 1099 contractors are experts stepping into a situation to provide their expertise, get paid for it, they're their own boss, and then they leave. Okay? Like I said earlier, I didn't want to spend too many minutes on 1099 versus W-2. If it still feels fuzzy to you in any way, which if this is new to you, it very well may, we have resources on the Informed SLP about the difference between 1099 and W-2, and they're also just kind of generally easy to find in our field. So Google any SLP 1099 W-2 stuff. All right, back to pay though. So back on track with the point of this lecture. So remember how I said like 1099, it's approximately a 10% pay difference. So where does that 10% come from? Okay, so first of all, you'll be paying approximately 7.65% of your annual pay in taxes above and beyond what you would be responsible for as a W-2. Because as a 1099 contractor, you are a business owner, which means you have to pay your own employment taxes. If you had an employee, if you were a true W-2 employee, the employer is legally obligated to pay those taxes for you. So the second you sign a contract as a 1099, you immediately are legally obligated to pay taxes that otherwise would not have been your responsibility, okay? So right off the top, just a little over 7% is coming out of your pocket every single year because you're paying your own employment taxes. But then add on top of that, you're also responsible for all your own expenses. You pay for your own travel. You supply your own job supplies. Everything is on you to bring what you need and pay for what you need. You can't get benefits legally as a 1099, no health insurance, no retirement plans, no stipends. You also typically aren't paid when clients cancel unless you have like a flat rate contract, which is more common in the schools, but less common in other places. So in general, like 10% is a squishy number. Sometimes people will ask me, 10%, that seems so low. I've heard 30%. Yeah, if you don't understand what a 1099 contract is, the pay difference implication is going to be more like 30%. It absolutely can be that high. However, the tricky thing about this is how expensive it is to you to be a 1099 contractor depends on a lot of different factors. And a big one is how tax savvy you are and whether or not you're using a CPA in order to help make sure that you're writing the appropriate things off. We won't go any deeper into that because SLPs should not be advising people on like what is or aren't appropriate write-offs. You really just need to have an accountant, a CPA, do that for you. But the thing to know as an SLP and the things SLPs can coach each other on is bottom line, it is more expensive to you to be a contractor, so your hourly or monthly pay as a contractor should always be higher than W-2. So just kind of lock that in your brain. 1099 pay always has to be higher than W-2. So if you're trying to compare two different jobs and one's 1099 and one's W-2, the 1099 pay has to be higher. Approximately 10% higher at least, safely maybe like more like 30% higher. W-2 is the job most people think they're getting. And most employers in our field will treat SLPs as W-2, but issue them 1099s. This is not good for SLPs, and it's risky for businesses due to misclassification risk. Okay, so contracts, back on track with our contracts here. Contracts are the most important detail for your pay and working conditions. SLPs are always talking about hourly rate, like, oh, I went from 50 per hour. I really want to find a job where I make 60 per hour. SLPs also talk a lot about 1099 versus W-2. They're very good at coaching each other that if you're in a 1099 role, you should be making more. However, contracts predict more of your pay than hourly rate. Contracts predict more of your pay than W-2 versus 1099. So these contract details and clinic norms, those things that can make a $50 per hour job pay anywhere between 60 grand and well over six figures, that is the thing that's most impacting our pay that I don't see SLPs talking about hardly at all. So playing with contracts and clinic policies while keeping hourly rates stable is how SLPs both feel and are being systematically underpaid. So you can keep paying SLPs $50 per hour, but if you keep cutting back on the things that you're paying them to do, what's actually happening is SLPs are being paid less over time. And then also to have this many contract types where it's normal to have salaried and hourly and variable hourly and 1099 and W-2, creating all these different combinations, is with all of those contract types being common is really, uncommon. So we have a really variable set of totally normal contract types in our field. And most professions aren't like this. So we have a uniquely variable set of contract types, even though that is kind of becoming increasingly common in the labor market across the board. We are most definitely like leading the path in terms of this. But hey, we're not even done because it's not just salaried, hourly, variable, and 1099 versus W-2, we also have agency versus direct. So we don't just have 6 very common contract types. We actually have more like 12 very common contract types. All of these contracts making massive difference to our pay. All right. Continuing on this, we don't understand our contracts nearly as well as we need to. So let's look at that agency versus direct thing. So the old way, and what most people kind of like still assume is the case, is that if you're a job seeker going out looking for an employer, and that the hiring relationship is between employer and job seeker, right? However, what's becoming increasingly common is that there's an agency in the middle. So it's not that you're signing a contract directly with an employer, you're signing a contract with an agency, and the agency has a contract with the employer. What on earth is going on? Why is this happening? So SLPs are hard to hire, and there's more open positions than SLPs. SLPs are also a minority in our most common settings, like the schools, hospitals, and it helps if you're trying to hire someone that's hard to hire to have expertise in hiring that like type of person in order to hire them successfully. And employers like tend to have expertise, like schools tend to have solid expertise in hiring teachers, but not SLPs. So like they'll send their hiring teams to like teacher hiring locations and conferences. A lot of times they don't have the budget to like also send their hiring team for the school district to like ASHA conference and stuff like that because it gets too expensive. They just don't have the niche hiring budget nor expertise to hire SLPs. But then add on top of that employers often can't not have an SLP for legal reasons. And all of this, SLPs being kind of specialist and unique to hire, and you can't just not have them, creates a solution or creates a situation in which we have desperate employers in need of a solution, and agencies come in as the solution. So here's how that works. I've created these little diagrams to kind of make sense of where things are happening here. So first, the schools, hospitals, and other employers find it hard to fill SLP jobs. They can't find SLPs. They're trying, they're posting jobs. They cannot find SLPs. So an agency approaches them with a solution. They say, let us sit in the middle, pay us, and we'll find an SLP for you. Or better yet, what the employers really want to hear is, we already have an SLP available for you that's ready to work. Sign a contract with us and we'll give them to you, essentially. So this is something that some of you on the call might feel a little disturbing. I found it disturbing once I first realized it. Recruiters are so common in our field that a lot of grad students now are asking each other for recommendations on who's the best recruiter, not recommendations on where they want to work. Recruiters, however, are simply sales staff. Recruiters are people who work for agencies and their job is to go out and find SLPs to sign into the agency in order to make these placements with employers. Okay. So recruiters aren't like a real estate agent who could take you to any house in a city that you ask them to take you to. Recruiters aren't like a hairdresser that could give you any haircut you ask for. Recruiter's job is specifically to place you with their agency, not to find you a good job, not to find you the best fit job, to simply find you the best fit job within their agency, okay? The economics of it. So what do employers expect to spend in this relationship? Employers expect to spend anywhere between 10 to 30% of an SLP's annual salary or annual pay in order to fill a position. So if they can't fill an SLP directly for 70 grand, they'll increase their budget, they'll pay the agency, and the agency will find them the SLP. These numbers are oversimplified. They can actually go in lots of directions, higher and lower than this. But this amount is paid annually if the agency continues to supply that SLP to them every single year. So that's the economics of it. The logistics of it, people tend to think it works the way it does on the top, but more often it works the way it does on the bottom. So sometimes what happens is an agency and an employer will agree upon a rate and sign a contract with each other. So the agency will have an active contract with the employer. Then the agency goes and tries to find an SLP to put into that position, okay? So the SLP is essentially last in that equation. An offer is made to the SLP in order to get into this contract that the agency has with the employer. More often, here's what's happening, especially with larger agencies. An agency will find an SLP, sign an SLP at that rate, like basically sign them at like $50 per hour, know the SLP is looking for in-person work in a certain city, like in-person work in Chicago, and they've signed a contract already at $50 per hour. Then the agency will take that, use it as leverage to then go try to secure a contract with a school, with a hospital, with a place, which essentially means that the SLP has signed a contract into a job before they actually have a place to be put into a job. So who goes last in this equation matters a lot. In the first situation, the SLP goes last. There's already a position. The SLP just needs to choose it or not. That's very different than the agency already having a contract with the SLP, and then that gets shopped to various schools, hospitals, wherever. So here's some of the risks and considerations. The agencies have to consider the pros and cons of not being able to find an SLP for a contract versus not being able to find a contract for the SLP. Also, whatever rate is signed first anchors the rest of the deal. So whenever a number is signed on a dotted line, whatever happens next has to work off of that number, right? SLPs typically understand less about this whole process than employers do, and SLPs also typically aren't as desperate as employers. And strategically, if you're trying to make as much as you possibly can as an agency, you want final negotiations to be with whoever has the most to lose or risk. So what ends up happening is agencies, in order to make all this work, they sign SLPs into contracts while trying to secure contracts with employers. So they're basically working all angles of this all at once. What this means for SLPs is you can have a job without having a job. And I have seen horror stories from like grad students who will move from the place where they were going to school, like move to, a city thinking that they have a job. And then once they end up being there, what ends up happening is the agency wasn't actually able to place them in a position. So they no longer have a job and they're not starting a job at all, but they've already signed like a contract for an apartment and stuff like that. Also, this is the primary source of ghost jobs in our field. And a lot of SLPs call these like bait and switch positions. But in reality, like the broader term for them across the labor and employment market is they're ghost jobs. So the important thing to understand about this is you aren't employed by the place you work in these positions. You're employed by the agency if you're W-2, Or if you're 1099, you're actually self-employed and simply allowing the agency to collect a finder's fee to place you in a job. So ghost jobs, what are those? In our field, the primary source of ghost jobs is agencies posting positions that don't even exist yet. But our field isn't unique. If you go and search ghost jobs online, you'll find lots of explanations for them. But across jobs databases, on average right now, 1 in every job postings is fake. They're not real jobs. They're just an ad meant to collect at minimum your email and resume so that the employer can build up a database of contact information, even if there's not a job. Or the next level onto that is it's not a real job, it's not a real opening, but they will sign you into a contract. They'll sign you into a contract as a rate and at a rate, and then they'll go try to find a position for you. So the take home regarding agency contracts is if you don't understand how agencies work, and agencies are much more common than they used to be. Agencies have gotten huge in our field. But if you don't understand how they work, then you also don't understand how your own contract works, nor what you can and can't negotiate and when you can and can't negotiate. So all the details you would want about a job in terms of caseload, schedule, hours, location, pay. You have to understand where the agency is in their process to even understand what they could or couldn't promise you, or if that promise even exists. So remember, for SLPs, what I said in the very beginning is your point of maximum power and impact on your own working conditions and pay is the point at which you choose a job and sign on the dotted line. So it's crucial for you to understand how contracts work so that you know what you can and can't ask for. And then here's the thing that I think really matters for SLPs to hear and internalize is that we have much more power than we realize. The labor market right now is hard. In general, most people in employment situations are losing rights, losing power, losing control. However, as SLPs, because there's a shortage of SLPs, it uniquely positions us to be able to kind of put our foot down and ask for things that people in other fields can't do. But we can because we're hard to hire. So we have a little bit more power in our pockets. So what do we want? At the very beginning, we talked about how SLPs want better pay and better working conditions. But you can't be that broad. You can't just be like, I want better pay. Who knows where it's coming from? You have to understand the levers in which you do and don't have control over, and which things you can request, which things you can demand, which things you can refuse in order to move toward better pay, both in the immediate sense, which with every single move you make on your own, but also as a field broadly. So what can we immediately control? If we want pay transparency, we just have to ask for it. It is really not that hard to require both annual and hourly estimates when we're applying for jobs. I would suggest that you demand it as an SLP before you even consider applying. Get that information as the first thing that you ask every single time, because remember I showed you how easy it is to ask, and employers really don't mind giving that information. Good employers definitely don't mind, and it's really straightforward, simple, easy, and it lets you know whether or not you should bother spending your time and the employer's time applying for a job. So if we want pay transparency, let's start asking for it. Or if we want more transparency with jobs in general, is it a ghost job? Am I signing a contract into a position where I don't even know where I'm going to work or if the job exists yet? Or what are the productivity expectations? One of the biggest things that came out of that survey a few years ago is that SLPs are feeling significantly burnt out. So what questions do we have to ask employers about the working conditions before we apply, before we sign a contract, before we show up on the first day, that would help us to be able to measure whether or not it's going to be a good fit for us? All these things are appropriate to ask before even applying for a job. And I would suggest that our new mantra as a field should just be, I don't apply for jobs when I can't understand the offer, and I don't apply for jobs when I don't have the details I need to decide if I even want to apply. Do not hand over your power by giving people your name and email address and resume and setting up an appointment for a Zoom call so you can learn more. Absolutely not. Request it in writing before you decide to take your time or the hiring team's time in even like moving forward with jobs. And asking about things like productivity or location are just as easy as asking about annual pay. So like if I was concerned about, like if I wanted to know about productivity for a job, I would send an email looking just like this. Hi, hiring person, insert their real name. I saw your job post here. I'm super interested. I do have one question. How many hours per week can I expect to spend in direct client contact versus indirect? And then just say, this will help me envision how the role works, and I look forward to applying. All the best. Make them get you that information. Every so often, the hiring manager won't be an SLP and won't know how to answer this. But if they're at all motivated to fill this position, which the vast majority of employers are, it takes them 2 seconds to shoot an email to one of the SLPs or CC an SLP on an email, and they can find that out for you very easily, very quickly. We do it every single day in our jobs database. And I would argue in general, and this is kind of my dream. What if, because SLPs are hard to hire, because we're uniquely positioned to put our foot down on a few things that are very simple asks for employers, what if our field could actually set an example and be at the forefront of workers' rights because SLPs are so well positioned to have that sort of impact? And that's what I would really like to see. So toward this goal, how are we attempting to achieve this at the Informed SLP? So I told you from the get-go that we have a jobs board, and our original plan was to make it just a higher transparency job board. We've figured out over time what it really means to do that, and here's some of the things that we're doing. Because it's not really just a jobs board, we have significant quality control in place, and here's some of the things we do. First of all, employers are required to fill out a deep application survey with details that SLPs care most about. In most job boards, an employer can create a login, type in whatever information they feel like typing in, hit post, and the job post is up. We don't allow that. They're required to answer the questions that we have. Our team of SLPs and HR experts look over everything to make sure that everything's clear, there's nothing weird going on. If we have follow-up questions, we ask them about it. And then if they pass through our system, then the job gets posted. So what would be some of the things that would cause them to not pass through our system? One is we block jobs that pay below the 10th percentile. So one of our goals was just to shave the crappiest jobs off and not even show them to SLPs. How do we do that? Especially when wage norm data isn't real strong in our field. We use ASH's data combined with ours, combined with a cost of living index specific to the city that it's being hired in, combined with the BLS data, but BLS data adjusted, because if you understand SLP's contracts, you can use it lightly, being able to predict which direction it's high and low, line by line, setting by setting. And that gets us close enough to having a 10th percentile baseline for any job that comes through our database. And if it's below the 10th percentile, we block it. We also block jobs with productivity over 85%. So productivity is a required disclosure in every single job. Even jobs that don't typically think about productivity, like for example, school district jobs, we allow them through without giving us a productivity number if they give us caseload and workload numbers instead. But I would also like to encourage us as a field to realize that you can actually obtain productivity numbers for any job, because all it is the percent of time in a work week you spend directly with clients. And even school districts can answer that. And so we've started to shift to pushing for true productivity numbers in as many job types as possible. And if it's over 85%, we block it. We block jobs with a documented history of lying. So if they're dishonest at all in our job posts, anywhere, they get blocked. If we have a documented history of mistreatment of SLPs, they get blocked. We also don't sell SLPs information. So remember how I said that a lot of these jobs databases, the primary function is to collect SLP's name, email, phone number, resume, all this stuff in order to be sitting on like a pile of contact information that can then be sold to our employers. We don't do that. Instead, everything is 100% consent driven, and employers don't get to know anything about an SLP who's looking at their job until the SLP says, yes, I'm ready to apply, and you supply your contact information to them directly. Another thing that we do is we call it quality control pay. You know, I'm obsessed with pay because I've been spending over an hour and a half talking about it, but all of our jobs are required to display both true hourly and annual pay. So our salaried jobs will look like this, where annual pay is displayed and then an hourly estimate is calculated off of that. Hourly, like true hourly, will have hourly pay with an annual estimate calculated off of it. And then variable contracts will have both numbers as estimates because by nature they're going to be variable. They're going to be estimates. They're going to be like a range with averages. And we essentially ask employers for payroll data, and we ask them all of the questions about the contract that we need to in order to be able to accurately determine true hourly and annual rates. And then we also have a third metric called informed pay. So notice how these two jobs, they actually have the exact same hourly and annual estimate. So they're both $40 to $45 per hour, $75,000 to $85,000 per year. So if you imagine not having that informed pay thing over to the side, you wouldn't actually be able to tell quickly on the surface which job is better for you financially. And so we developed this third metric called informed pay, which essentially takes into account the value of all the other financially relevant details that are within a contract. So it adjusts for you 1099 versus W-2 financial implications. It also adjusts for you the financial implications of benefits, stipends, reimbursements, and any other money thing that can cause that value or what essentially is like true pay to go up or down. And the purpose of that informed pay metric is to allow SLPs to more quickly comp jobs to each other. And then as far as like, because we're really big on quality control at the Informed SLP in both our research and our jobs database, we have more too. So all of our job posts are standardized. And what I mean by standardized is, like I said a few slides ago, employers can't just get in and put whatever they want in there. Instead, we have headers and subheaders, and they're required to fill in every single one, and every single one exists for every single job. That way you can compare apples to apples, and you can see the location for every single job, productivity for every single job, all the relevant contract and operational details like benefits, reimbursements, cancellation policies, even things like whether or not they have non-competes and non-solicits, plus a ton more details like what is the schedule, how many days per week am I working, what hours am I working. I one time was in an SLP job for only 30 days because they told me that like sometimes I'd have to come in early and sometimes ended up having to be there before 7 a.m. every single day, and it didn't work with my daycare schedule with my kids, and so I had to quit within the first month. So like these are all things that we know are really important to SLPs, whether or not they're doing a lot of drive time traveling, whether or not they have their own office, what PTOs look like, what holidays look like, parental leave. Like we try to ask all the questions that you might need to ask an employer, and in particular, the ones that would be awkward for you to ask, like parental leave policy, because that's not something that you can typically comfortably ask employers before applying, but we can ask it for you, and then it's disclosed right there in the job post. We also ask things like whether or not you accept CFs, the percent of CFs at your company, supervision. We have tons and tons and tons of information that we require from employers, and anything they choose not to disclose says undisclosed. So if they like leave the parental leave section blank, it says undisclosed. That way you're constantly able to pay attention to what information they're giving you and also what information they may be withholding. So I mentioned that we block jobs too. So what percentage of jobs coming in are blocked? When we first launched our database, we were accepting roughly 75% of the jobs coming through. So that means 1 in 4 employers who was trying to post a job with us, we had to block them because the job was crap and they weren't being transparent enough with us. Today, we're accepting roughly 90%, but most of it is because we're sitting now after a year on a long list of employers that are just blocked from our database. And also over time, people are getting more used to what we expect, so they don't bother even submitting their job if they're not going to be able to adhere to our quality criteria. So what do these blocked jobs look like? 30% of jobs that are blocked because they won't disclose location. So these are ghost jobs. 30% of the blocked jobs are blocked because they're withholding required information. So we asked for a detail. They wouldn't give it to us. We replied to them via email and said, hey, we can post your job, but we need this, this, and this piece of information. And then they just ignore us. And so that ends up being a red flag in our database. They can try again if they ever decide to disclose the information, but that's why they're not allowed in at round one. 20% are due to high productivity, over 85%. 10% are due to low pay, and 10% are due to poor reviews, meaning we have data indicating that they're mistreating SLPs, so we don't even let them into our system. What else are we doing? We're also teaching SLPs everything we possibly can. So we have a whole section under career advice that helps SLPs understand a lot of the things that I'm teaching to you today, as well as even deeper topics like negotiation and raises and stuff like that. We're collecting and sharing data. And anytime we collect data from SLPs, it will always be open access. So any things that we do where we're gathering information for SLPs because we need it or we think the field needs it, you will always be able to download our full data set. So we do have a pay page where you can download SLP reported wages. We additionally have data on employer wages, which we're actually going to be soon making that a lot more visible too. But right now it's built into job posts and we're about to start extracting a lot of it from job posts. So in the context of the Informed SLP, some of the things that have been hard about making this transparency first jobs database and hard about trying to figure out how we can help when it comes to, pay and burnout in our field. The hardest things for us this past year and a half, 2 years, I guess, depending on when you measure the start of it from, has been helping SLPs understand a system that, first of all, is highly complicated. I mean, it took me almost 2 hours to describe things to you that I feel are bare bones basics, like you shouldn't even be on the job market without understanding these things, and that regularly aren't being explained well to SLPs. But then also not only are SLPs operating in a system that's complicated, but also the system benefits from them being in the dark. There's a lot of ways in which it's better for other people for SLPs to not understand these things. And that's been really unique for us as a team to deal with, because that was never a problem with scientists in our research database. When we started translating research for SLPs and helping connect them to the research and help them, use the research more efficiently, scientists wanted exactly that too. And so their response was always just, oh, thank you for doing this for SLPs. And we were like, you're welcome. But now it's a lot more complicated because we're doing something for SLPs that a lot of employers want, but not all employers want. And so that's been a little different. And then also getting employers to be willing to try hiring differently, the people who like our system, but are a little on the fence and a little hesitant about it, because we definitely make employers jump through more hoops than any other jobs database. And that's a little different. And we have to convince them that it's worth their time to do. So as far as how that's been going, so far in 2026, we're almost halfway through it. SLPs are using the information that we're sharing slowly but surely. Not nearly fast enough. We wish we could just drop a bomb on the field and be like, everybody stop talking about pay in hourly terms only. We are screwing ourselves over and making it harder for us to get paid more. But getting people to deeply understand that, as you all can see from this lecture, is kind of complicated. It takes a while for it to set in. It takes a while for it to set in for us. And so we're working really hard at trying to educate SLPs, but we need other people's support in educating their peers as well. And we will continue to try to figure out how to get SLPs informed about their own jobs and pay as efficiently and clearly as possible. And it's a thing that we're actively working on. But then what about employers? So the employers who get it are finding success in our database and loving it. And that's the thing that's really keeping us going, is the employers that feel as though we're basically like a godsend to the system. And by get it, I mean the employers that understand that lies don't last. That if you're lying and misleading people in the hiring process, all it does is create higher turnover, and then you're somebody who's hiring a new SLP every 2 years, and that's not fun. Employers who get it understand that SLPs figure out all these details eventually anyway, so trying to withhold them from the get-go doesn't help anybody. Also, that transparency is a sign of respect and partnership. So it helps fill jobs faster with better qualified people if you're really clear and really honest with them from the get-go. That's an immediate sign that you're the type of person that an SLP would want to work for. And SLPs don't want to work with people that withhold information from them or are lazy in describing their job offer. They don't want to see misleading job posts that aren't honest with them and then receive 30 recruiter texts from the agency later on. That's not, SLPs don't like that. And that the thing is like, you don't have to hustle as hard with aggressive outbound sales and recruiters and all that stuff if you're simply doing inbound right in the first place. And employers know what I mean by inbound, but for the SLPs on the call, that just basically means if what you're showing SLPs in the first place is honest, clear, and helpful, it helps SLPs come to you. You don't have to spend as much time aggressively going out to them. So top employers who really get what we're doing and are like, sure, I'll take 15 minutes to answer all your questions. Why not? Let's do it. These people are filling their jobs faster and cheaper than places like Indeed. And this is definitely a biased statement that I'm going to say, so take it or leave it. This is just my opinion. But I think employers are going to be filling their jobs with our field's best SLPs too, because the people who already interface with the informed SLP are SLPs who were here in the first place because they care about EBP, they care about their clients, and they care about their jobs. And so that's the feedback that we've been getting from employers who are finding SLPs through us, is that they're finding really high quality SLPs through us. So our hope is to be able to make an impact on all of the things that are kind of plaguing our field most right now. And we feel like we've made a pretty good start at it. If any of you are SLPs or employers who have feedback for us, ideas for us, things that you'd like to see us do that we're not doing yet, we always love hearing from people. So on this final slide is contact information. So first of all, thank you for taking the time to listen to all this. I believe very deeply in this topic and think it's really important. So I hope this has been valuable to you. Our website is theinformedslp.com. If you want to reach anybody within the jobs staff, so there's a few of us who operate the jobs inbox. You can email about anything jobs related to jobs@theinformedslp.com. If you need to reach me directly because you think that I'm the only person, or for some reason you want to speak directly with me about anything related to the Informed SLP or employment or jobs, feel free to email me directly as well. I love interacting with folks in our field, because the more feedback and input I get from other people about what our field needs, the more I can help ensure that the Informed SLP is continuing to make good impact on our field. So don't hesitate to reach out. Thank you all for your time, and hope this has been helpful.